Hello everyone. This is a video lecture for ITS. So for ITS 454, which is Assured Systems Design and Implementation. I'm Professor Calix. Okay, and so this would be the lecture lab for March 26, 2020. Okay, so this is for this week, as you know, now we're doing things online. On Tuesday we had our midterm exam, so this is kind of a short week where we have a midterm. So basically on today's session I will go over a project. So this is usually where I discuss one of the projects. You usually do two projects in this course along with your labs. So you have A, B, labs obviously, and everything leads to the practical exam. Okay, practical exam. So that's usually how this course works. Actually I should say labs. So there's project A and B, then there's labs, and then there's, at the end of everything, the practical exam. However, given the current situation that we are now online, unfortunately, as far as I understand, unless anything changes, between now and May 8th, we're probably not going to have a practical exam. Okay, so instead, because of social distancing and everything else, we're probably just going to have a written exam at the end of the semester, unfortunately. All right, so that will be, so you can expect the type of final exam. So that's one change. The labs will continue as they are. As you know, in this class we heavily use hardware, and we were using our Cisco hardware for most of the labs. What I would say is the good news is that we had completed a lot of the labs. I think we only had like 2 labs left. I'm still trying to figure out if I can make some changes there to a virtualized environment to finish up those 2 labs, but we will see what happens there. Definitely though, as I said, if we're going to do everything online until the end of the semester, we're not going to have the practical exam. So we will continue to do labs. I mean, some of the labs are virtual VM labs that seed labs that we can still complete. We don't necessarily have to do them in the hardware, so that's the good news. Okay, so I will talk a little bit more about labs next week, so you can expect information about labs next week. Okay, our VPN lab and so on. More IDS, anomaly detection systems. So those will come next week. Today, usually the week of the exam, I talk about the project. So I talk about, the 2 projects that we're going to do. And so today I'm going to talk about project A, which is the RCM project, or the risk and control matrix. So usually in the past, this project, the RCM project, was also done at the university. So we would, go to the university, and then every group would get a building on campus. Right, and so, the information services would help us out. We would get people from information services, IS, to kind of take a group. Every group would get an assigned building, and then basically IS would give you a walkthrough of the building, and then you would go over, obviously, as you might imagine, the network security, assets, threats, and controls related to the network security of that building. And then at the end of the semester you would do a presentation. All right, so we're still going to do this project, the RCM, except that obviously we can't do it on campus anymore. So today I'm going to provide some alternatives of what we could do. So let's start talking about the RCM project. Okay, so we're going to start talking about it. This stands for Risk and Control Matrix. So I should define, and I'll provide some slides, but it's Risk and Control Matrix. And the way that I like to think about it is, at the end of the day, this project leads to, an Excel spreadsheet. So it leads basically to a spreadsheet, that captures all the information that we need. All right, so, as I said, the options were, usually we do this on campus, right, at the university. All right, another option is to do it, so for some of you may have, may work for companies that have network security, large enough network security requirements, and so some students have done that in the past. So at a company, it's important for me to note and specify for you that we need to do presentations at the end of the semester. So you'll need to present this project, and usually everyone that's doing these online videos nowadays is posting them on YouTube, and so obviously that will present some challenges if, for the privacy of the company, right? So the privacy of the company. And so this may also present another challenge that, if you work for a company, what I would say is you would need to talk to your boss. So you need to talk to the IT manager of your company, and tell them, I'm doing a risk and control or a risk analysis, risk assessment of the company, or maybe just a department of the company, and I need to get some information. So that's really what you guys are going to have to get. So you need some data and info about a company, and then you need to perform a risk assessment. So risk, say, analysis, and so on. So that results in a risk and control matrix. Unfortunately, that may, take some information, not necessarily privacy, but that may, the company needs to give you some information about their network security. And that usually will be problematic, especially if you're going to be loading that on YouTube. So if you decide to do this with your company that you currently work for, you're going to have to ask your boss and tell them that you're going to be posting these videos on YouTube. And so, they may give you some information that they don't really mind that's on YouTube, but they may not give you all the information. So we have to deal with that challenge, but that's a possibility. The third option is, of course, you either create a company, out of your own imagination, so create company, or research company online. So basically whatever is available publicly already, you might be able to do a risk assessment in this situation. So basically, given the circumstances this semester, I leave it to everyone. Actually research a company could probably be its own bullet. So I would say, campus is probably out, but these are certainly possibilities. So you're still going to do this in groups of 3. So this is still a group assignment, so groups of 3. Same groups you've been using all semester, or 2, no more than 3. And please, so I'm giving you this guidance right now, so please, via email, every group, one person in the group, keep in mind I'm getting so many emails. So one person in your group, make the decision what you're going to do, either a company you work for that's willing to make the information available, create a company, or do research of a company, okay? And so pick one of those, and then make a decision and then commit to that. All right, and so you will basically, so as I said, once you've selected a company, then you're going to perform the risk and control analysis, okay? So the risk assessment of that company, what I call the RCM project. Okay, so I hope that's clear. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. So now that we've talked a little bit about it, so once you've selected a company, you will have to perform a risk and control matrix. So that's what the lecture today will be about. I will provide more information about all these, all the things that are required for this project, and hopefully it'll be clear. This is one important thing I should say. This is not a lab. This is a project, and therefore you have until the end of the semester. So you have, this is due the week before finals. Before finals. Okay, so this is due the week before finals. Okay, so this will be due the week before final exams. Okay, so you have a few weeks to work on this assignment. You obviously start today, use today's lab, if you will, to contact your teammates, to start thinking about how you're going to do this, maybe do a little bit of research, and then pick, as I said, either obviously campus is out, but a company with your boss, that would be, the greatest, because you would actually get some real data. Unfortunately, that, may be limited. Or if not, create a company or research online. Okay, so that's, so basically this is the project that I wanted to talk about. Hopefully I've covered everything. I do have some documents, and so I'll go over those in a second. Additionally, there's the other thing I wanted to do today is, given that things have changed quite a bit, I wanted to go over the resources that we will be using for the semester. And keep in mind, some of these things may change. Some of these things, I may add things as questions come in and problems are raised, etc. Okay, but for the most part, I'm trying to keep everything as similar as possible to how I had it. So let's go ahead and look at some things, some adaptations that I've okay. So the first thing I want to go over is I want to go over Blackboard. So I have made some changes to Blackboard to make it, I guess, more online. So I want to go over, Blackboard is still the main element or instrument that we're using for the semester. So I've put some information here. In particular, I want to point out that I've created a separate website, which is this one. Okay, I'm in case Blackboard goes down or or any circumstance like that, you have another resource that you can always check, and you should please check this regularly. Okay, what I would suggest is check it every day that we have a class. Take a look at it. Sometimes the video, after I record a video, it takes a couple of hours for the video to actually post to Blackboard. So just be mindful of that, but the videos will appear. I'm currently posting the videos on YouTube, but so that they're not disorganized, what I did is I created this website which has a calendar. So I'll go to the website. I have it open here, and you can see it here. This is the website. And what's important about this website is that I've created a calendar. So this calendar basically should illustrate where we are. So you can see here, I've specified everything that we've done since January 14th until March 12th. Then we had a spring break. You guys had your midterm exam on Tuesday. And then today I am discussing, the risk assessment RCM project A. In one side the video is complete, you will see a little link here that says video, and you'll be able to, once you click it, you'll see this video basically. And then going forward, we'll have a few labs. As I said, the practical exam will not be a practical exam anymore. It'll be a written exam unless things change. I guess it's possible that we could be back on campus if the law changes. The guidelines change, but otherwise, as far as I understand it for now, everything is online until the end of the semester. One thing I want to point out, if you read through here, it says April 28th, April 30th, we have project presentations. So during that day, I'm going to ask you guys to create videos. So you're going to create videos of your presentations, you post them on YouTube, and then we're going to find a way that we can make the links available for everyone. Okay, so that way everyone can look at the videos of everyone, you know, and we can see what other presentations look like during that day. And I'll be, obviously, that's how I'll be able to evaluate your presentations. Okay, so that's the plan for April 28th to April 30th. So the calendar, you know, keep checking on it. I'll be updating it and adding videos and links as we move forward in the semester. But, you know, I wanted to point that out. A few other things I've specified in this website that might be useful to you. I need to add online office hours. So I'm still debating and testing which tool I'm going to use. So it's looking like it's going to be either Zoom or WebEx. I'm going to be testing that Zoom application today or tomorrow with some students, and based on how that works, that may be our approach. So, you know, I'm going to put some information here under office hours, online office hours, so that you can, you know, follow the guidelines. And then we're going to specify probably like an interval of time, like on Tuesday or something, when you can connect. You know, some information is pending on that, and I'll come back to it. Okay, so I need to, you know, still updating things. Here's a link to the CVM in case you don't have it. And then, yeah, so that should be all the information related to the calendar. As far as the website, as far as Blackboard here, I also want to specify. So like I said, the videos will appear on that calendar. You can follow this link to it. That's a good way. Instead of just giving you the YouTube channel, I think that'll organize things a little bit better. The other thing I did, and I hope this is helpful, is that I rearranged the way that I had my folders on Blackboard. So basically, I used to have a folder for lectures and a folder for labs. I got rid of the folder for lectures, and I moved all the lectures into the respective labs. Okay, so that way, you know, it's a little bit more clear. So you can see here, these are the labs that we've done before. Currently, the RCM lab now has both, for instance, the slides that were in the lectures folder are now in here, plus an example that might have been in the project folder, and so on. So everything is now sort of in a module type format. Hopefully this will be a little bit more helpful, given that, you know, everything is online now. So we will see how that works. But just be aware of that. So I've moved everything, so, you know, you won't see the lectures folder anymore, but it's because I moved all of that into the respective. So the sniffing lab now got the slides for that, and so on. Okay, so I hope that helps out. So basically, you know, in summary, there are two things that you can check: Blackboard, and then this website, which is the calendar that has the links to the videos. Okay, so please check on that, check on both elements. Okay, so that should wrap up Blackboard. So let me close it. All right, and then we don't need the website anymore, I think. Okay. All right. Okay, so now that I've talked about that, so I kind of motivated what we're doing as far as the project and all the information about the course. So now let's go back to the risk assessment. Right, so let's go back to the risk assessment here. So okay. So now, you know, I talked about the project. I talked about the project, and so I'm going to discuss the slides. Oh, also, before I forget, actually, in that folder for RCM, there's 3 documents. There's the slides that I'm going to do today. Then there's another set of slides, which is an example of how you can do the risk and control matrix. So you can basically follow that format, and I'll discuss that last today. And then there's a Word document, which is basically just additional questions that you should address for this RCM project. So let me go over that as well, so I can close up this document as well and doesn't consume resources. All right, so the RCM project. As I said, RCM, let me make this bigger too. Okay, so RCM stands for, oh yeah, I have the pens. Okay, so RCM stands for risk and control matrix. All right, so risk and control matrix. So that's what this stands for. So this is these are the things that you need to look at for the project. Okay, and as I said at the end, I will provide an example that should be useful. So obviously, the first thing you will need to do is find a company or define a company, and so define a business. Once you've done that, you need to answer some questions. So what's produced by the company, what service is done, what industry this company is a part of, where it's located, and then you're going to start looking at the technological or the technical requirements. So what are the IT requirements? What departments does it have, etc. Okay, so that will be some of the things you need to define. Then you need to define the business objectives. And then finally, once you've done all of that, you can start focusing on this part, which is the RCM. All this information from these questions is what allows you to create a risk and control matrix. The first thing is, in any RCM, you first need assets. And assets doesn't just mean like physical, tangible things. It can be intangible. Then you have threats, obviously, to those assets. And then you have the controls that need to be in place. Okay, so assets, threats, and controls. So you're going to define all assets. Okay, so define all assets. Then you're going to perform a risk assessment. And in that risk assessment, you're going to define all threats to your particular business and map them to business objectives and security controls. Okay? You need to try to quantify the impact of each threat and rank the controls. So in the slides today, I will provide some examples of how that works. There's no real like math or science that goes into this. It's more of a perception. Okay, so you're just going to do your best of a perception to quantify this in some way. But I'll provide some examples of how that could be done. So this section should include a description of the business, risk assessment, the impact, and then finally the grid of business objectives to threats to controls. Okay, so you need to kind of look at that. What's the objective of the company? Obviously, the controls need to tie back to what the company actually does. You will do the risk and control matrix, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet. So it's Excel, right? Spreadsheet is a table of all assets, threats, and controls. And then you're going to discuss for each technology, discuss aspects for each technology, such as device hardening, etc. So things that we've covered in the labs or we've discussed throughout the course this semester. And of course, it's always very helpful to include like diagrams of your environment. So of your business, you're going to you can create some diagrams that gives us a better picture of what we're talking about. And as I said, once I provide the example, that should be useful to get a better understanding for what I'm talking about. And finally, you're going to write a report. I need a report of what you have done for your project. Okay, so these are some of the guidance that you should follow for today's for this project. Okay, this semester we have, you know, the second half of the semester to work on. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so now that we've talked about the requirements, before we look at the final example of how to do this, let's go over some of the slides. These slides will allow us to to define basically, some of the things that you should address. Okay, so as I said, all right, so these are the slides for a risk assessment and RCM, a risk and control matrix. Okay, so what is our, so the first thing is I keep mentioning this word risk assessment, so I should probably define it. Okay, and I'm going to say, what is a risk assessment? Okay, so this is a formal process for answering the questions. What assets in a company need to be protected? How are those assets threatened? All right, so how are those assets threatened? And what can be done to counter those threats? That is, what are the controls? Right, so usually you see this term in finance and IT and healthcare, controls, right? So those are the things that you put in place to mitigate risk. Okay, so the goal of this risk assessment is ensures that critical assets are sufficiently protected in a cost-effective manner. Keep in mind that you can't protect a company so much that all your budget goes into just protecting it, right? The company needs to be profitable at the end of the day, so you have to find some kind of a balance there. So a security risk assessment is needed for each asset, and keep that in mind. You will have to, that's why you have to list all the assets, and then you will have to perform an assessment of all the assets in the organization that require protection. And finally, the risk assessment provides the information necessary to decide what management, operational, and technical controls are needed to reduce the risk identified. So keep in mind, controls don't always have to be technical, right? Some controls, they're a firewall, but some can be operational, managerial, such as having people be responsible for things, or having trainings, for instance, things like that. So basically, there's an IT security management process. In this course, we focus mainly on securing the network, right? So you guys know we've had a network, kind of looks like this, and you've spent a lot of time looking at how to break it or implementing technologies to secure it. However, before you get to this whole technical side of securing things, you want to have policies. Right, so you want to have policies in place, and you actually want to have some kind of a life cycle. So if you notice, this is a loop type of a process, right? So it's kind of being executed over and over and over. So first, you define organizational aspects, security policy, right? And then that goes into a risk analysis process. Security risk analysis, you can see that. And then that security analysis, allows you to define, what controls should be in place, and, defining a plan that you should follow, right? So you perform that. Once you have the plan, you move into the implementation phase. You can see that there. We move into the implementation phase where you implement the controls. You also do trainings and awareness. And then, but that's not enough, right? So once you implement the controls, you still need to follow up. So you need to follow up in the process, and that basically means, doing maintenance, things change, so change management, complying with security, making sure that controls are in place, and then also what happens if you do have a breach, an incident, how do you handle it, right? And then once you've done that, you have to kind of go back and reassess everything, and go back and reassess everything, and so on. So it's kind of a life cycle, all right? So that's an important it's important to understand that this is, a life cycle and a process. So the risk assessment, right? So we're talking about the risk assessment. So it's a critical aspect. Ideally, you examine every organizational asset. So you have to spend some time identifying what the assets are first. It may not be feasible always, right? So you have to consider that. And here in the next few slides, we're going to define what are some approaches to perform this risk assessment. And it's basically, a broad overview of how you can tackle this. All right, so how you can tackle this. All right, so approaches to identifying and mitigating risks to an organization's IT infrastructure. And they can be loosely classified into baseline, informal, detailed, and combined. All right, so that's just one way of organizing them logically. So let's look at the baseline. All right, so we're going to look at the baseline approach. And in the baseline approach, the goal is to implement agreed controls to provide protection against the most common threats. So that's really, what you're doing there, right? So, the idea is you use the industry's best practice. Okay, this is, the industry best practice. So baseline is, you guys are IT students, you know about security, so you kind of just go based on what you know. There's no real process. You kind of just say, well, my industry is healthcare, so we're just going to take the industry's best practices. We're going to look at HIPAA and other policies and laws that, that we're required to fulfill. All right, so this will be the the simplest approach. And it basically forms a good base for further security measures. So at least you can think of it as the baseline starting point. And then from there, you can start, as the life cycle continues, you can start to add more complexity. So this is the easiest and cheapest. It can be replicated. It gives no special considerations to variations. In risk exposure, you just think the most basic approach. And it could be, because it's not tailored to your organization, it may be too much or too little security, right? So you kind of have to, as I said, it's more of a starting point than anything else. In general, it's recommended for small organizations without resources to implement more structured approaches, okay? So just simple, companies, small businesses, etc. An informal approach is a step further, okay? So it's a step further from the baseline, okay? This one, and basically what that means, usually as you start stepping up, it just means you have to do more, you have to collect more data, you have to do more analysis, right? So that's really where these are. Here you have more data and more analysis. Okay, more analysis. So this one involves conducting an informal, pragmatic risk analysis on your organization's IT system. So, keywords there, pragmatic, informal. It definitely exploits the knowledge and expertise of analysts. So this is, you have to interview the stakeholders in your organization and kind of get more information from them. What do you think are the assets? What needs protecting, et cetera? Those kinds of questions. And this would have been, this approach would have been what you would have done on campus, and what you need to do in this project A, right? So in project A, if possible, you would want to ask someone. So this is why I would encourage you to, if possible, to work with a company, especially if you have an employer, but if that's not possible, it's okay, to do the research online or even create your own company for the purposes of this assignment. But yeah, so the idea here is that you would exploit the knowledge by asking questions of the experts and stakeholders. It's fairly quick and cheap. right? And you can make judgments. So judgments can be made about vulnerabilities and risks that baseline approaches would not address. So again, some expertise here comes in both from the analyst and from the stakeholders to kind of make judgments. Obviously, there may be some incorrect assessments that can be expected even in the most complete assessment. It will be skewed by the analyst's views and point of view over time. Obviously, everyone, and what this means is that everyone has their concerns. Everyone has a thing that they're worried about. And this one is suitable for small to medium-sized organizations where IT systems are not necessarily essential, right? So, obviously, banking and things like that have higher requirements, but here, this is still suitable for small and medium organizations. Now, the detailed risk analysis, this will be obviously, as the word implies, the most detailed approach. And again, this means just a lot more information. Again, even more info and even more analysis. And even more analysis. This is the most comprehensive approach. You assess basically using formal structured process. You're going to use more formal approaches, so you're going to have number of stages, identify threats and vulnerabilities to assets, and you want to identify some type of a likelihood of risk. Okay, so here, some of the slides further in this presentation will show examples of how to do this. So identify likelihood of risk occurring and consequences. So ways of quantifying that. This will take significant cost in time and resources and expertise. You might imagine that this might be, you actually have personnel just in charge of this. So it takes more. And usually this is due because it's a legal requirement, right? So there's, Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, and then there's HIPAA, HIPAA, and so on, right? So legislation basically that, makes this more of a requirement of compliance, and so you need a lot more work for it. This is suitable for large organizations, so this will be suitable for large organizations where IT systems are critical to their business. So nowadays, everything, especially now that things have changed, right? Everything, all IT is critical, even more critical. But banking and the most critical of businesses. Okay, and then there's combined approaches, combined elements. This combines elements of other approaches. So initial baseline. You might start with a baseline, then you follow the informal analysis process, and then you go into the formal assessment. So that could be an approach. Okay, so that, that's basically the idea, and this is the most complex one, of course, of all the methods. Okay. So once you are about to start, so when starting the risk assessment, the first thing that you want to do is figure out the context. So the initial step is determine the basic parameters of the risk assessment. Right? So you want to determine the basic parameters of the risk assessment. So here you want to identify the assets to be examined. Right? So you want to define the assets to be examined. the context basically means exploring the political and social environment in which the organization operates. So for instance, what are the legal and regulatory constraints? If you're in finance, a finance company, bank, etc., you're going to be governed by certain regulations and legal constraints. If you're in healthcare, the same, and so on. So you need to provide a baseline for the organization's risk exposure. So identify all laws, identify risks to that industry, etc. Another aspect that you need to address is the risk appetite, right? And the risk appetite basically refers to the company itself. It's the level, so it's defined as the level of risk that the organization views as acceptable. So this is usually, something that is determined or set by the CEO, right, etc., of the organization. So they're usually, the upper management are the ones responsible for defining the risk appetite, which is the level of risk of the organization. Okay, so as we start moving into the, what is the risk and control matrix, risk and control matrix, we need to define a few parameters. So, basically the terminology. Okay, so, a few things that we need to define are asset, threat, vulnerability, and risk, right? So asset, anything that has value to the organization. And this can be both tangible and intangible assets. So it can be, the router, the server, but also it can be privacy. So it can be privacy, it can be reputation. Obviously, if, your information is leaked, etc., you start, that's a reputation issue because the company, the users will not trust that business anymore, right? And so that's going to affect their bottom line eventually. A threat is a potential cause of an unwanted incident, right? So it's something that can happen which may result in harm to a system or organization. A vulnerability is a weakness in an asset or group of assets which can be exploited. So, and you guys understand this really well, vulnerabilities. We look at them from a technical point of view whenever we do our labs, right? So basically it's a weakness. And then the risk is a potential that a given threat, so notice that this is a combination of terms. So a risk is a potential, the potential that a given threat, right, will exploit a vulnerability. Okay, so, and then of an asset, of course. So notice how the risk definition combines the three previous terms. So the potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets to cause loss or damage to those assets, right? And that, is quantified, as I said, in a damage to the asset of value or, privacy, etc. So as you know, whenever we think about threats, we, tend to classify them. You probably remember this from your course 350, right? The pillars of information assurance. We tend to identify them as, based on the principle that we're trying to protect. So are we trying to protect integrity, availability, accountability, authenticity, confidentiality, reliability, and so on. So anything that might hinder or prevent an asset from providing appropriate levels of the key security services, right? So as you remember, integrity has to do with somebody not modifying the data. Confidentiality is that no one can look at your data. Availability, that the services are available, and so on. And as you remember, this ties into threats, like denial of service attacks, etc. Okay, so this is something that you probably remember from your previous classes, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. All right, so now that you will, as I said, you'll have to analyze risk. So after in your risk and control matrix or in your project, as you start looking at things, you're going to have to find ways of quantifying risk. So the idea is to quantify. So you want to do, you want to quantify in some way, or you want to measure maybe, or define. So let's use the word define actually. So you want to define risk in some way. Okay, so so how do you do that? So we're going to look at some examples of how this can be done. So you want to specify the likelihood of occurrence of each identified threat to an asset given existing controls. Okay, so this first one, so usually you could use something like the probability. So there's a 0.30 or a 30%, let's say, probability that this could happen or that can happen. And some people do this, actuaries, etc., and insurance companies, they actually go to that level, and you could. However, we're not going to start there, obviously. Our goal would be more to classify things as very likely, unlikely, somewhat likely. So we're going to categorize these likelihoods in some way, all right? And so I'll provide some examples. That's called a risk register, and that's a tool that we can use. We can specify also what are consequences that should what is the consequence should the threat occur. Okay, so that's another aspect to look at. And then based on that information, we want to define overall risk rating for each threat, right? So given a cost and a probability, right? So you want to quantify if your server is down 2 days out of the year, how much revenue would you lose? Well, you can estimate the cost of those 2 days that the server's down on average, and then multiply that times some kind of a probability of the likelihood that that will occur over a period of 10 years, and then maybe arrive at a number. So you can do a lot of calculations for this kind of thing. We are not going to get that specific in this course or in this project. We're really just going to do our best to quantify it in simple terms. So it's hard to determine accurate probabilities, actually, even if you have historical data. It's very difficult. And it's also difficult to estimate realistic cost consequences. You really don't know if data is exposed, or how to quantify the impact to your organization. So it could be very catastrophic, or it could be pretty simple, or not too bad. So in essence, I did say at the beginning that we're trying to find quantitative ways. I probably should have said we're trying to determine some kind of likelihood. So you could use both qualitative or quantitative. We're going to basically just use qualitative for our purposes, right? So we're not going to go to the probability level, but instead we're just going to say, very likely, unlikely, etc. So another thing that you can do in your risk assessment once you've identified assets and threats is now you're going to identify the existing controls. So you want to specify, analyze the existing controls. Existing controls used to attempt to minimize threats need to be identified. Okay, so existing controls used to. Given if you have an organization that already exists and you're doing the analysis on that organization, then you look at existing controls. Obviously, if you're starting a company from scratch, then you have to do the asset threats and then figure out what controls should be in place. So either way, you're going to end up identifying some controls. Now let's look. So the classification of controls can be managerial controls, operational controls, and technical controls. So for the most part in this course, we look at technical controls. We looked at firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and device hardening, ACLs, all of that. And other tools like VPNs for encryption and so on. But not every control needs to be technical. Some will be managerial and operational, and so we will look at some examples of that in the slides today. Okay, so a good way to do controls is to have what are called checklists. So this is a very common practice in industry and accounting firms in particular. they have checklists. They're also called sign-offs. And so the idea is you have a list of controls that are in place, and then there has to be a person responsible for each control. So, there has to be accountability. You can't just put a control in place and then just say, well, Peter was in charge of it, but, or actually not Peter, but you'd say, oh no, well, we put it in control, but it wasn't my responsibility. It was my bosses or whomever, right? Or the supervisors. At the end of the day, you need to find a person and assign them that control. So that person, usually the IT person, is responsible. So it's a combination of the control and who's responsible for it, for implementing it and for checking that it's currently in place. So you use checklists for existing controls and interview key organizational staff, to solicit information, make sure that they know that they're responsible for that control. All right. So as we start to quantify the risk, here's an example of how we can qualitatively calculate likelihood, right? So instead of calculating probabilities, you can have something like this, a risk likelihood, all right? So you have, basically you provide a rating and then you provide a description. So likelihood description is something like rare, unlikely, possible, likely, almost certain, right? So you can use this type of a Likert scale, way of doing things. And so basically it goes some from rare to almost certain. So in rare, it may occur only in exceptional circumstances, and it may be deemed as unlikely or very unlikely. So it can go from there to almost certain, which is expected to occur in most circumstances and certainly sooner or later, right? So you can use the risk likelihood. Once you have your risk and control matrix and you have your assets, threats, and controls, you can use this approach to try to quantify, what is more likely to, what risk is more likely to occur and which one is less likely, and that'll help you to determine how, to identify where to focus your attention. Risk consequences, that's another piece of information that you use, very similar to the previous one, and this one just assumes if it happened, what is the consequence? Is it very significant or doomsday, right? So, for instance, in the current situation with the coronavirus, right? So no one expected something like this, right? If, and before, when you were doing your analysis, you might have said, the consequence of this would be moderate. You wouldn't expect it to be, let's say, catastrophic. Hopefully it's not catastrophic, but major. So you use this information again with the ratings here to kind of quantify things and figure out, what's a bigger risk and what's a smaller risk. Now, once you've started to quantify things and you've identified your assets and threats, then you can start to create some kind of a risk register, and that's just the name, for you trying to quantify things. So notice here that now this is starting to look more like the risk and control matrix. So this is starting to look more like an RCM. Okay, so you have assets, threats, existing controls, and then you have likelihood, consequence, and then level of risk and risk priority. So you intuitively start to create a classification of things. So for instance, let's look at this example. You have an internet router, all right, and the risk to it or the threat is an outside hacker, all right, and then what is the existing control? Well, you have an admin password only, and so what is the possibility that an outside hacker could attack it? It's possible. And then the consequence is moderate, so it's not catastrophic. And then based on that, you say, well, the level of risk is high, and you quantify it as a priority 1, and that makes it a top concern. Whereas the destruction of the data center, of course, could be a fire, flood, right? There's nothing, no disaster recovery plan, and so, but it's unlikely, right? It's not very likely to occur. However, if it did happen, it's a major consequence. And so obviously then that could still make you to conclude that it's still high, because even though it's unlikely, if it does happen, it's going to be a major disruption to your organization. And so that's what the risk register does. It helps you to kind of quantify things a little bit better, as you do your risk assessment or risk analysis. So obviously there's a trade-off whenever you're doing judging risk. Basically there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off. Okay, and what that means is that, with everything that you do in a company, it's all about cost, right? Because at the end of the day, the goal of a company is to maximize shareholder wealth, right? So it really wants to increase profits, reduce costs, etc. But, securing the company, sometimes that investment does not really result in increased revenue. Actually, it may affect it, right? And so the idea is that you have to find a balance. So here we have a little graph that explains this relationship. So, on the x-axis we have the cost of treatment, and then on the y-axis we have risk. So there's a trade-off. So what this means is basically if the risk is low and the cost is high, it's uneconomic to accept. So you basically assume the risk and do not implement any controls, because the cost is prohibitive and you can't really do anything. On the other end of the spectrum, if the cost is very low and the risk is very extreme, then obviously you implement it. I mean, if it's maybe open source tools will reduce this risk and it's not very complex to implement, it's a no-brainer. The problem is this gray area here, right? In this gray area, it's more difficult because, as the risk goes up, the cost also goes up, right? It's linear, and so in that case, you need to execute some judgment, right? So you need to do your best to figure out the best approach. So there's got to be a balance between cost and implementing your solution. All right, so now that we've covered some of the terminology, we're going to go over a example before we actually look at another case. All right, so in this example, this is the Silver Star Mines case study. So we're going to just think of how we could do a risk assessment on a company. All right, so this is let's imagine that this is a fictional operation of a global mining company, right? So we're starting to define the context. So this is the context. All right, so that means, it has a large IT infrastructure. It has software off the shelf, plus they have to write some code in-house. It relates to health and safety, so they have to comply with some regulations. Systems used to be isolated, but now they're networked, so your approach will be some kind of a combined approach. It can't be necessarily baseline because you have to really put in some effort, given that you're subject to legal and regulatory requirements. Okay. And management accepts moderate or low risk. So basically, they don't really want risk here. They might accept a little bit, or moderate, but not too much. All right, so that's kind of the context of the problem with the silver mining company. So then as you proceed with the risk assessment, the RCM, you're going to look at things. So first of all, you want to identify the assets. Okay, and so that, basically the company has SCADA nodes that basically translates into, they have conveyor belts and systems that are networked, right? So they have, manufacturing, or I guess excavation, mining technologies that use sensors and are connected to a network. So that you want to maintain the reliability and integrity of those systems. You want to maintain the integrity of stored files, databases. availability and integrity of financial system, of the procurement system, and of the maintenance and production systems. Okay, so those are, purchasing, payment, payroll, and any other kind, and also obviously the mail system, right? Email. Right, so you want to, those are the assets, some of the assets that you've identified here that you want to protect. And so now you perform the risk register, and so as you can see here, we have the assets that were mentioned before, and then we have some of the threats. So for instance, you have attacks. So that's a common one: attacks, corruption, and theft, loss of info, unauthorized modifications. So those are some of the threats that were identified. Then you look at the existing controls to the organization, and you can see basically you have security policies like user account management, etc., firewalls, and so on. And then you start looking at, the likelihood, the consequences, so that you can finally arrive at the risk priority. So here, for instance, we take one example of the SCADA systems. You said the likelihood of an attack is rare. However, the consequence is major, and therefore you want to classify it as a risk priority 1. All right, whereas look over here with the email, the attacks on the email are almost certain, but the consequences are minor. So for the email, I guess there's nothing confidential there, so you're not so concerned. But you still say it's high, and then you decide some classification. So notice that this is based on judgment. I mean, at the end of the day, you can make a decision as to what you think is more critical to the organization and least critical, but at least this approach does help you to start to quantify. And that's how I would describe a risk assessment. It's at least you're documenting everything, and you're finding ways of quantifying or documenting everything and organizing it in some way. So the case study, given risk assessment, the next stage is to identify possible more controls. And the conclusions might be here that, and this is what you would do when you do your risk assessment. You look at, the company that you've decided, and you identify, well, it's clear that many categories are not in use. And then you identify the problem. So maybe software is not patched regularly. There are no contingency plans. Maybe you need more technology like intrusion detection systems, better centralized storage, and backups, right? So at the end of the day, this is the process would result in identifying the things that are not there and that need to be improved. But as I said, the risk control matrix allows you to organize things. All right, so you can see that here, once you have the assets and the risks identified, right, the asset and the risk, then you can specify the controls that should be in place, right, the controls that should be in place. So for instance here, okay, so for instance here we can say that the controls that need to be improved are better configuration, spyware, more monitoring, contingency plans, backup systems, etc. So you start adding more controls in place. Okay. So the final term that we need to define is the security control. So notice that a security control is just a general term to refer to firewalls, policies, and everything, right? So anything that could be used to reduce risk to an asset. Okay, so anything that could be used to reduce risk to an asset is a control. So here we define it. So control is defined as a means of managing risk, including policies, procedures, guidelines, practices, or organizational structures, which can be of an administrative, technical, managerial, or legal nature, right? So just, the law, right? So if you, steal something, you go to prison. So even, all of those are controls that are in place to mitigate risk. Okay, So controls can be divided into these three categories. So we have technical, operational, and managerial. So the most common one, especially for us in this course, ITS 454, is technical controls, right? So they involve correct use of hardware, right, or software, right? So you guys are aware, all of these, VPN, Cisco ASAs, ACLs, access control in Unix, etc. Right? So all identification with Active Directory and so on. So all of those are the tools that you know about. But additionally, there's managerial and controls, and then there's operation and control. So managerial refers to issues that management needs to address. It focuses on reducing the risk of loss and protecting the organization's mission. So it might be something that comes from in a top-down approach, from managers, right? And we'll see examples of that in a second. And then operational controls address correct implementation. So they focus more on how to implement things. So correct implementation and use of security policies. They relate to mechanisms and procedures. So they relate to mechanisms and procedures that are primarily implemented by people rather than systems. So this is important. Okay. All right, so let's go over here. So we can see here, these are some examples of operational, managerial, and technical, right? So technical, as I said, access control, auditing and logging, logs, identification, AAA servers, system and communication protection, VPN, and so on, right? So all of those technologies. But over here in the operational side, we can think of things like training, having a contingency plan, an incident response plan, having security personnel, physical and environmental protection, right? So those are more operational things that you have in place. And then on the managerial side, the managerial over here, we have things like the planning, right? Perform the actual risk assessment, right? It has to be performed by a person. The RCM, right? So the RCM, this documentation that needs to be in place, a process of acquiring things, managing the life cycle, right? So managing the life cycle. Okay. And so on, right? So that's kind of the general classification of security controls. So another thing that is very important as we start to look at a risk assessment is a cost-benefit analysis. And that's, as I said, the important thing here is that in a company, security doesn't usually increase revenue. In fact, it reduces revenue, right? So it reduces money. And so there has to be a balance between, how much money you're willing to spend on something to protect the assets of the company. So obviously some money has to be spent on that, is important, but there are limits because the goal of a company is not to secure its assets necessarily, but it is to maximize shareholder wealth. So it needs to use those assets to make more money, right? And so there's got to be a way, so a balance must be found. So a cost-benefit analysis is a process that allows you to do that. It needs to be conducted by management to identify controls that provide the greatest benefit to the organization given the available resources. Okay, and this is usually quantitative, so that because there's cost involved, right? And so people can. It's a combination of qualitative and quantitative to figure out, how much money can actually be spent. It's usually determined by the budget. So companies have budgets that they use, and they try to figure out, in order to purchase things. So it must show the cost which is justified by the reduction in risk. So there's, you try to have some way of quantifying that. It can contrast the impact of implementing a control or not, and estimating the cost. So as I said, if if the cost of a threat, of a vulnerability is very low, they may not even do anything about it. So controls need to be selected, obviously, and top management needs to kind of be aware of these controls and kind of sign off on these, especially for publicly traded companies. The managers need to sign off on these kinds of controls. So, and so on. So it's fundamentally a business decision, and that's really what you can say. It's the responsibility of management, and ultimately they will define what they can afford and what they can't. Okay, so once you've done all of this, you can define a security plan, an IT security plan, and that's really the ultimate goal of an RCM. So you do an RCM, then you have a plan in place, and then you implement, right? And that's what we saw at the beginning with the slides when we saw the life cycle. So this provides details of what will be done, what resources are needed, who is responsible. And I want to point this out because it is very important, right? So it's not just about putting controls and then forgetting about them. Somebody needs to be responsible for these. The goal is to detail the actions needed to improve the identified deficiencies in the risk profile. So it should include risks and recommended controls, selected controls, responsible personnel, and maintenance requirements. Okay, it's a process, right? It's a process. So here's an example of the implementation plan. Once you've completed your risk assessment, you can create like binders, where you have, the risk, the asset, and the risk, the level of the risk, and then what are the recommended controls. So these are all the things that you would do, strong policies for passwords and so on, the priority, and then the resources that are needed. So this requires training. You need also to specify the time that an IT professional will spend on ensuring this is implemented, and the responsible person. Notice here, this is important, right? So John Doe, the network system administrator, and then obviously the dates and any comments, right? Need periodic test and review of configuration and policy use. So as you can see, this kind of concludes the whole process. It brings together, and it's this is, I would think of this as just creating a binder, right? So you create a binder of a company, you create all your charts, risk assessment, and then finally you end up with something like this. And obviously this is, a starting point. Always think of it as a starting point that can be modified over time. All right, and that concludes our slides. For this topic. Okay, so the next thing that I will do is I'm going to go back to the project. And now that we've gone over the definitions and the concepts, I have here an example of what I expect you to do for your project. So your risk and control, or your risk assessment project, could be like this. So you can follow this as a specific guideline. All right, so let's take, for instance, so this is an example that I have of a previous semester. So risk analysis and assessment of the Anderson building, right? So imagine, so in this case, if you have your company, you take one building of it, and now you start to perform the risk assessment. So you want to do an RCM analysis and a report of it. So, first you start to define, what is the project scope. All right, so first you define, okay, so, business objectives of Anderson. So, you determine all assets, you determine possible threats, controls in place, perform the risk assessment, create the RCM, and then also discuss other topics like the network topography. All right, so this is important because even though as you spend time on your project, you may have a very good idea of how it works, when you do your presentations, you will need to explain, so you will need to explain to me and to your classmates, this company. So you want to discuss the network topography, the diagrams, etc. All right, so it's a, obviously we start with this is a university, so it's a university, so you want to provide, what are the business objectives of a university? So provide an affordable, high quality education, right? So you want to provide education, improve awareness of the university. The goals of management of the university are to grow enrollment, increase retention rates. So these are things that are, they use, and grow and change as necessary, adapt, and so on, right? So these are the business objectives. So for your organization that you choose, I ask you please not to just use examples of universities, but, find companies that are of interest to you and analyze them, and so on. All right, so then once you have that, you continue, as you think of the business objectives just specifically for information systems, for that company, then, provide services for students and faculty. Obviously, Blackboard, we think of Blackboard and other things. Maintain, upgrade, and standardize classrooms. Develop active learning, collaboration rooms. Increase storage for faculty and students, automate and simplify the flow of information across campus, and support high quality teaching, focus on student success. So you have to start to quantify the business objectives of the organization in some way. And usually when you're doing this, you can probably look up the companies. They already have business objectives defined anyway. So once you've done that, then you start to look at the assets. So we're thinking of a university building, right? So we're thinking of that, and so the physical location. So obviously the buildings themselves, within it the physical equipment, the routers, switches, wireless access points, cables, and then intangible assets. I would say there's faculty data, student data, credit card information, availability of the network, right? IP schemes, security controls. I would also say privacy issues, student information, grades, and so on, right? So all this information, all of this can help you to create, what are the assets of the organization. Okay, so in particular for a building at a university. So then you start to think of the risks. So the risks are obviously malware, virus, Trojan, worms, spyware, rootkits, and so on. Additionally, denial of service attacks, data theft, privilege escalation, phishing attacks are pretty common. You get those via email, as you know. And so that's another issue, right? That's another issue or a concern. Additional things, and actually they had it here when they did their presentation: social engineering, so impersonation, identity theft, phishing, configuration errors, access control, out-of-date software, out-of-date hardware, physical threats, fires, floods, and so on. Pandemics. Right? That's a new one. All right, so and so on, right? So you imagine this pandemic, I'm pretty sure a lot of plans did not have that. So you can see, this is a good example of how people probably have created risk assessments and they never consider this, right? And, we're seeing that the implications of this are pretty big. And so definitely something maybe you guys want to consider for your project. All right, so as you can see here with their example, now they've taken, I would say you should put the asset and control matrix. So have some assets here, and then you have the threats. So theft, data theft, hardware theft, floods, and so on. They quantify the severity of damage, probability, you can see that. Oh, here they had the assets, okay? And then finally, I would say, you know, have over here maybe the risk priority. Priority there, and then have the controls in place. So what are the controls that are used to mitigate all these risks? You can see here, you know, firewalls and so on. Okay, so this is a good example of an RCM. I mean, you know, you might organize it. It doesn't have to be organized this way, as long as all the information is there. But this is a good example of how to approach it, and then just include here, you know, the risk priority as well. All right, here we have, you know, a continuation of it. You can see it more of an example, more threats. Over here, severity of damage, probability, assets, controls, and I would just recommend, again, include the risk priority. Okay. All right, so then you can, you know, once you've defined that, you can start, you know, just adding comments and conclusions to your work. So, you know, as you can see there, from their work, per our matrix, there are several high priority risks, you know, several of severe damage, you know, out-of-date components, improper configuration, spam and phishing, and, you know, this is a common one. So you can think about all of these as the main risks to the organization, okay? These risks have been determined to be priority due to high probability and severe damage. And so, you know, I leave this to you guys, to your best judgment to provide basically conclusions. So then you can talk a little bit about what controls you would put in place. Obviously, when they were doing this analysis, because they had a building, Anderson, you know, they could just simply ask, right? So they can simply ask the IT professionals to tell them, you know, what they had in place. So some of the suggestions there were VLANs, they had training, updates, maintenance, throttling the network, cameras, spam filtering, monitoring, network access control, MAC lock, ACLs, deep freeze, you know, antivirus, and so on, right? Separate student network, etc. So there could be, you know, quite a bit of controls that they have in place. This is the one thing that it would be nice if you could ask questions to an IT professional, just because that's kind of one of the goals of the project. But given our current circumstances this semester, you know, we're going to have to adapt a little bit, right? So use your best judgment as you do your research, unless, as I said, if you find a company that, you know, maybe your own employer that's willing to help you out with this project. All right, finally, you know, one thing that I do recommend, please provide floor plans of the business. You know, this is helpful just to get a better picture. So it doesn't have to be too specific, but you can see here the students are identifying the network setup. And so they provide a little bit more description. So they identify main distribution frames, how are things connected, you know, where the devices are located. And it just gives a better intuition, you know, of what your network looks like. You can see that you have the intermediate distribution center and so on. All right, and, you know, more examples of the diagrams. That's certainly helpful. So some kind of a network diagram and some pictures just to kind of give us a better idea. So you can see here, you know, this as you have this, you can get an idea of the network requirements, and then you can start talking about the controls that are in place, right, for all of these network devices. Right, you can see here more information about network racks and so on. So this basically, you know, then at the end of your project, have some conclusions, right? But I think that should help you Hopefully this example will help you to create your risk and control matrix. So please remember, as soon as you finish this video, work with your teammates and get back to me. Just, it might take a couple of days, but get back to just one person per group. Get back to me. Send me an email. Just so please, send me an email just indicating what type of company you're going to do, if it's a company that you work for or if it's a company online. But send me something just so that I know that you're working on this and what to expect. Okay. If you have any questions, please email me. We're also going to set that. I'm going to try that online office hours starting next week. So hopefully that will be a good way to communicate. All right. So this concludes our video lecture lab on RCMs, risk assessments, and risk and control matrices. Thank you.